immediately challenges central space and opens diagonal lines for piece development. Developing a knight to control central squares, aiming for flexible piece play in this English opening. Developing the knight to a natural square, nc3 eyes the d5 and e4 squares, preparing to contest central space should black advance their pawns. Boldly contesting the center with a pawn and knight outpost, this immediately opens lines for piece development and potential counterplay. Developing the king's bishop to g2 reinforces control over the central dark squares and prepares for kingside castling, creating a solid defensive structure. A bold piece development that immediately challenges central control and opens diagonal avenues for attack. Solidifying the kingside while eyeing central control, this bishop retreat prepares for a controlled kingside expansion. Solidifying the kingside defense, black prioritizes security before engaging white's central ambitions. Developing the knight to f3 now frees the e-pawn and prepares to contest the center's dynamic pawn structure. Reuniting the rook with the defense offers solid support, but delays development and potentially surrenders central influence. Securing the monarch's safety with this castling solidifies white's king position, preparing for centralized action. Trading the bishop for a knight here relinquishes your bishop pair advantage and softens your kingside pawn structure. Doubling pawns on the b-file concedes structural weakness, potentially opening lines for black's pieces later. Developing the knight to its natural square reinforces the central pawn and prepares for potential d-pawn advances. Solidifying the center and preparing a pawn storm gives white a comfortable, yet active middle game. Solidifying the center and preparing a potential pawn break with e5 is a logical step, opening lines for the bishop. Opening the center dramatically simplifies matters, creating dynamic pawn breaks and demanding precise calculation. Shifting the knight to the kingside aims to bolster defenses and prepare for a potential pawn push later. Launching a knight to the edge seeks to disrupt black's central control and potentially I-squares like f5. Reclaiming central influence and preparing for a kingside pawn storm, the knight retreats to a more active post, eyeing potential attacks. Shifting the knight to the 5th rank intensifies pressure on black's central pawn structure and prepares for potential breakthroughs. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing to push the d-pawn forward are the immediate goals here, subtly reinforcing black's central structure. Securing the b-file, white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and prepare potential queenside expansion. Unleashing central pressure, black aggressively contests the d5 square, seeking to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for active piece play. Opening the central file immediately challenges black's pawn chain, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares and potentially create an outpost for white's knights. Reclaiming the central pawn opens lines, creating dynamic play and challenging white's space advantage. Reclaiming the center with pawn pressure reshapes the board's central fight. A bold pawn sacrifice, aiming to shatter white's central pawn structure and liberate black's pieces. Seizing the central open file now solidifies white's pawn structure and prepares for queenside expansion. Breaking the pawn chain and opening the g-file aims to exploit the weakened kingside, creating active counterplay. Suddenly, the pawn chain splinters, opening avenues for your knights and potentially creating weaknesses around black's monarch. Seeking a safe harbor, the knight retreats, prioritizing protection over immediate counterplay, a patient regrouping amidst the central storm. Targeting the b7 pawn creates immediate piece activity and disrupts black's pawn structure. Reclaiming the knight under attack, black aims to disrupt white's centralized pawn structure and potentially target the weakened queenside. Sacrificing the queen to shatter black's queenside pawn structure and exploit the open c-file creates a decisive advantage. Reclaiming the rook from the open file shores up your defenses after the material imbalance. Liberating the bishop from the pawn chain, preparing for queenside pressure and improved coordination. This maneuver aims to reposition the rook for active defense and potentially challenge the b-file, while also preparing to contest the central d-file. Reclaiming the bishop's diagonal opens avenues for the queen and rook to pressure the enemy's weakened queenside pawn structure. Asserting pressure on the open c-file, black prepares to contest it and potentially exploit weaknesses around white's king. This pawn push aggressively claims central space, creating attacking chances but potentially weakening the kingside pawn structure. Seizing the open file offers immediate pressure, but leaves your king a touch exposed to advancing pawns. Forcing the black king into the open, a risky but potentially decisive maneuver given the pressure on the dark squares. The rook's retreat surrenders critical central control, weakening the pawn structure imminently. Exchanging the rook simplifies to an endgame where white's bishop pair will prove dominant over black's isolated pawns. The knight's central occupation after the exchanges is a precarious but potentially active outpost, looking to disrupt white's pawn structure and create counterplay. Securing the open file solidifies control, preparing for a decisive pawn advance or piece redeployment. The knight now occupies a crucial central outpost, disrupting white's rook activity. Solidifying the central control, this action seeks to exploit the compromised knight outpost and restrict black's piece mobility. Pushing the pawn forward creates immediate central tension and challenges white's bishop. Solidifying the central pawn structure, this bishop redeployment anticipates pawn advances and reinforces key squares. Fortifying the king's shelter against potential pawn pushes on the kingside is a prudent defensive measure here. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure prevents any immediate infiltration and prepares for a potential kingside attack. Aiding the knight's journey to a more active central square. Securing the king's safety amidst the storm, this advance aims to build a defensive shell. Reigning in the monarch to secure its safety is paramount as the pawn structure dictates future maneuvering. Activating the monarch toward the center is a bold step, aiming to exploit black's somewhat passive pawn structure and potentially create dynamic imbalances. Repositioning the king seeks refuge from the open diagonals and prepares for a more active role. A tactical reshuffle to activate the rook on an open file, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain initiative. Reclaiming a vital central square, this knight readies to contest the rook's occupation and potentially disrupt white's coordinated pieces. A bold check, aiming to disrupt the knight's position and potentially create mating threats. The king's flight towards the center now makes it an active piece, prepared to influence the crucial central squares. This move reclaims initiative, aiming to disrupt black's solidified pawn structure and create weaknesses. Re-establishing a pawn presence on the kingside now feels like the most logical pursuit, reinforcing your structure. Trading queens simplifies into a rook endgame where white's active pieces and pawn structure offer promising counterplay. The black king bravely ventures into the center, aiming to solidify its position amidst the remaining pawns. Transitioning to a pawn endgame with this capture solidifies white's material advantage by eliminating a key defender. Exposing the king prematurely transforms this into a race to see who can better consolidate their remaining pieces. The king ventures out, activating for the endgame skirmish. A vital maneuver to consolidate the king's central position and escape the rook's confinement. Solidifying the queenside pawn majority with this bishop repositioning offers excellent defensive and offensive potential.